Good afternoon, just everybody. I'm very pleased to chair or moderate this panel on Macron's agenda. The question is an implicit one. Can he still do what he seemed to set out to do when he was elected as president? And what we propose to do is to split this into three short sections. The first on the politics behind what he's doing, where I'll ask Christine Ockrent to give the introduction. Then we'll turn to his economic agenda, and third, to his European agenda. So without further explanation from me, what I'd like to do is start by asking Christine what seems to be a very straightforward question. Now that we've seen the reaction of the Gilets jaunes, is Macron going to follow in the footsteps of all previous French presidents and back down on his reform agenda, or can he continue to be politically different from the others?
Thank you, Iain. I believe Macron is already continuing with his reform agenda, in spite of the very acute social crisis that has really strangled the country for the past 4 months now. And I think he can succeed for two reasons. One is paradoxical, that the Gilets jaunes are helping him in the sense that all the smaller fringe parties, starting, it's amazing to say, with the traditional ones, the conservatives on the one hand, the socialists on the other hand, those two traditional parties that Macron smashed down when he was elected back in 2017 have not at all recovered and have been totally unable to take advantage of the Gilets jaunes. And the Gilets jaunes are themselves unable to organize themselves in any coherent form or fashion to try and become a political force. So Macron emerges very much like he did at the first round of the presidential election, and actually the figures are exactly the same. You find that Macron has the same score in the polls as he did for the first round of the elections, facing Marine Le Pen, who also has exactly the same score. And again, the far left with Mélenchon has not taken advantage of the Gilets jaunes either. So the more the Gilets jaunes, or at least that hardcore, to simplify, of violent people continue, and we'll see what happens tomorrow, the more public opinion, which was hugely supportive of the Gilets jaunes, the more public opinion gets tired of them. So it helps Macron. And it's interesting that even when the crisis was at its climax, December, January, some very difficult reforms, like the pension reform, for instance, has certainly been delayed somehow, but it's still more or less on track.
Let me push you on one question. One of the things that Macron has been accused of is his Jupiterian demeanor. He's above normal French people. Is that breaking the promises he made when he was elected?
Macron never made any promise that he would be down to the ground with us common mortals. And, you know, the French have a very ambivalent attitude towards their president, because they, in fact, ever since they beheaded the king, they long for their president to have some majesty. And in fact, that was the problem of the previous president, Hollande, who was, who had promised to be simple. Well, he was too simple for the French. That didn't work either. So the problem with Macron is that he's too smart he's too smart, and he's too eager to show how smart he is. And so he cannot resist at times, and it has been politically embarrassing and damaging for him. But at times he cannot resist making jibes, but he's promised that he wouldn't do that anymore. He just did again, of course, a few days ago.
Jean, let me turn to you on this. Macron has been doing a tour of France, apparently listening to people. Do you think this listening exercise is going to lead to a change in political tone?
Let me first say why I, in part, agree with Christine, in part disagree. I think I agree with your sort of political assessment within the confine of traditional politics. So certainly, I mean, he's recovered partially, and the traditional opposition has weakened, with the exception of the National Front, which is sort of a repetition of the presidential election. Now, what we've discovered also is the degree of the distance between the political sphere and the citizens, and the rejection of traditional politics, of politics in general, of politicians, by the citizens. So the danger is that he's dominant within a narrow space, and that this system doesn't have the legitimacy anymore that makes it possible to exercise power, which is a sort of definition of a revolutionary situation. I think we're seeing that in France, we're seeing that in other countries too. And the question is how to connect with the bottom half of the population, who feels it doesn't have a voice, it's not taken care of in the decisions that are taken, and who believes in whatever conspiracy theory there is around, doesn't take any information from the traditional media. So it's a sort of split that we're seeing. And I think the key for Macron is to find ways to reconnect to this side of the population. So the debate that has started is relatively successful. I mean, it was a big gamble to say, well, let's open a debate. Now, people participate. Who participates? That more the senior people, that more people from relatively small towns. That's not the cross-section of the population, but there is participation. People do not challenge the existence of the debate. In fact, they find, many people find that there is an opportunity to have a voice. The question is what comes out of it, and the question beyond is, what sort of form of democracy you're going to put in place that are going to elicit more participation and more the feeling that there is a voice for the people who feel they don't have a voice in the traditional political system. And that's a big challenge.
Yorgo, you're an observer of France. You spent a long time living in Paris. How do you, as an insider who's outside, see what's happening in France politically?
Yes, I am keenly aware that I'm the only non-French of the three people here. Therefore, these are the words of an outsider. But they are the words of somebody who I think realizes that the rules of the game have changed profoundly. And I mean, if you go back, who would have thought before the election of Emmanuel Macron that somebody in France with an established political system, with the parties as they were, could do what he did? Okay, let's remember, this was somebody who was an outsider to politics as such, who managed to come in. Okay, the stars aligned. He was very lucky in the choice of the opposite party from the right. But, fortune helps the bold. And he managed to do, not only to win a presidential election, which with a two-round system in France is particular, but also to then have this tremendous parliamentary majority. So within the space of a few months, he completely changed the French political system. Now, when you do that, the first thing that happens is that people's expectations go to the roof. And I think people expected too much. And hence the quick fall, which of course was helped also by the fact that his personality is such that it is easy to sort of be perceived as being arrogant or difficult or not being in touch with the people. So now after the expectations were too high, then suddenly the expectations were too low. Everybody was saying he's finished. Well, the first wasn't true. The second isn't true either. You judge a president over 5 years. And I think we're in a very critical point now. And I'll pick it up where Jean left. he has to do two things, which is not clear how they're compatible. The one is to change French attitudes in a number of domains. France remains a country wed to a particular way of going about it, both in politics and economics, which no longer seems to be in tune with how the world is changing, and at the same time protect some of the people that are being hurt. I'm not sure how the two are compatible. It's a very tough trick to pull, because when you liberalize, you create more precarity and more people are in danger of losing jobs or having lower incomes. If you protect, you have to close certain things, and therefore you go against liberalization, which is what France needs. So it's a very difficult trick, but I think that politically speaking, he's in a reasonably good place, because the rest of the political system hasn't regrouped to challenge him. So he's got a window of opportunity. Will he be able to use it or not, I think, is still an open question.
Right, thank you. We're very pleased also to be joined by Tassos Chomenidis, who is the Managing Director of Lampsa Hellas Hotels, but more importantly, French educated, having been at the Ponts-et-Chaussées school in Paris. Tassos, you as a businessman, when you look at what Macron is doing, do you think it's sensible policy, or do you think the business community will feel disappointed by him?
First of all, in front of this panel, I feel as an Englishman in New York, but anyway, because I'm not professional politician. For the business, that means for the everyday economy, what is important is how we can combine the efficiency and the competitiveness of an economy with also people, working forces who are not neither desperate, not unhappy, not pessimistic. It's impossible to go forward having this big reaction on the other hand. This, to my feeling, this is the problem. I would like to add two things. How important for me is the new attempt to go to the people. I don't think that this kind of attempt is something that will, it helps only Macron to get over the problems that he faces, but I think that this kind of material introduces a new way of discussing with people. That means decentralization, that means what democracy needs now against authoritarian other regimes. And last is something that George talked about. Before being lucky, he already attracted 15% of the French society. What for me is which is a phenomenon. Why? Because he's not de Gaulle, he's not a personality, historical personality, and he's not coming from a party. He's not socialist party, I don't know, whatever. So out of the political system, he attracted the 15%, but this 15%, this is also important, remains, now is about 20-25, it remains faithful to him, remains faithful to him, which means that there is a modern layer in the society in France which understands that we cannot continue the way that France was, but on the other hand, which also understand that the ruling class has also to endorse all these reforms, keeping the equilibrium with the working class also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to introduce an innovation for Delphi, which is one question from the audience in each section. So does anybody have a question they would like to put to the panel on the politics of Macron? If you don't want to use my innovation, we'll go straight on to the economics. Okay, here, please. And I stress a short question.
It'll be very short, Iain. My name's Chris Langdon. I write about thinking the unthinkable. I found what you said about the domestic political agenda very interesting. Can I, paradoxically for an Englishman, ask about the European objectives?
We'll come on to that.
Ah, okay, then you are going to do that, okay. Yes. But let me just lay my question down for later. In terms of his European agenda, how successful will he be in terms of his reform agenda?
Okay, we'll pick that up in the subsequent section. Anybody have a question on the domestic politics? Last chance? Right, you've had your chance. Don't say I didn't offer it to you. And we'll now move on to the economy. And I'm going to ask Jean to introduce this by posing a straightforward question. The French economy, certainly when you compare it with the German economy, has not looked very healthy over the last 10 years. Macron came in with the promise that he was going to transform the economy. Is he succeeding in that endeavor?
It reminds me of what George said about expectations, right? That's, we've been lagging behind for 10 years, and the question is, has it changed for good? Changing the course of an economy, we know, takes time, and it tends to get worse before it gets better. Now, let me say something on the agenda. Essentially, what Macron did was initially tax reform, labor market reform, a series of sectoral reforms, railways, education, etc. That's a significant package by French standards, not really completely sufficient to address the problems there were. Now, what comes next? There is one big issue, which is public sector reform, because this Gilets jaunes movement is also a tax reform, but also tax revolt, but also a demand for better public services. So the squeeze on the state is significant. People want to pay less taxes, they want better service. So value for money is essential, and that hasn't really started. And then there is a big reform that was pension reform that has been postponed a bit, as you said, but it's still on the agenda, and which is about not saving money, but about creating a universal pension system in lieu of the very fragmented system we have in place. So that's what's on the agenda. Part of it is a very sort of standard structural reform agenda, with lower taxes on capital income, lower taxes on companies, some more liberalization of the labor market, etc. Part of it is of a different nature. It was an empowerment agenda. And I remember when we had this panel in the LSE, we discussed that. Empowerment agenda meaning giving people, ordinary people, the tools to perform, to develop projects in this economy, this more open, liberalized economy. And this has been about professional training, it's about school reform, it's about pension reform, also will increase mobility, etc. So far, the structural reform agenda has been very visible. The empowerment agenda has been less visible. And so the big question is also how to balance the two. And the fact that he's been dubbed President of the Rich means the empowerment agenda has not been really perceived as such. Now, the measure he introduced in response to the Gilets jaunes, in part, was to front-load measures that, in-work benefits that make it more, increase the return on labor and the incentive to join the labor market, as well as being distributive. So, in fact, it's been positive from this viewpoint. But I think a big challenge for the future is to give sufficient visibility and credibility to this empowerment agenda so that people perceive there is something for them in it, and so that the unfinished business of transforming the French economy can continue because there is sufficient support for it.
Thank you, Jean. That's a very good introduction. Christine, let me ask you, do you think that the agenda that Macron has is fundamentally a centre-right agenda, Or do you think that the empowerment that Jean's just been talking about goes far enough to attract the left supporters that are looking at the way he's reforming the economy?
Jean would say that you are referring back to a political landscape which has more or less disappeared. So I think these labels do not apply at all. I mean, that was part of Macron's attractiveness when he was elected, that he would say that old-fashioned vocabulary had indeed, and particularly as far as the economy is concerned, had not helped anything except that, conservative governments or socialist governments would never proceed, as you hinted at in the beginning, to any real reform. So I don't think that's the issue. I think the problem is that the French know very little about the economy. The level of education as far as economic matters are concerned, and I think Jean would subscribe to that, I hope. Well, he doesn't seem to, but I will finish my sentence. The level of economic education is very low, and also, I'm sorry to say, among us journalists, okay? So, the French are convinced that not only can they pay less taxes and have more public services, but that they don't want the state to intrude upon their lives as individuals, but when there's a problem, they want the state to intervene. It's currently, that's exactly what's happening with Ford, the car maker, closing down a factory near Bordeaux, which also explains why Bordeaux, strangely enough, became really a very, very strong bastion of Gilets jaunes. So that would be my only remark, that part of the difficulty, not only for Macron, but for anyone, is that you deal with public opinion, which finds it very difficult to relate to basic notions. That being said, it's very interesting that if you believe in polls, and there's a moment in such confusion where you have to try and rely at least on some argumentative elements. When you look at polls, people would say, oh, I'm against Macron's policies because he's the president of the rich. And then when you take a poll, for instance, about the pension reform, you have a majority approving it. When he did, and it cost quite a heavy bunch of money, he reformed the railway company. People would have sympathy for those on strike in the railway company, but in the polls they would say, oh, he's right to reform. And so I think that gets back to the political dimension, and of course with the Gilets jaunes is very much a 2.0 social crisis, where people express their anxieties and their anger, with social media as individuals. And they don't relate to trade unions. And one of the issues, again, is that French trade unions are too weak. And that doesn't help either in trying to have a dialogue between the Élysée, the government, and social and economic forces.
Jean, you wanted to contradict, maybe?
Yes, a little bit, because actually, people did not oppose the reforms so much. But they criticized him on tax fairness. On tax fairness on two grounds. First, that the tax cuts benefited the top 1%, essentially. And that's absolutely correct, that those taxes massively benefited the top 1%. Disproportionately. And second, that the carbon tax was unfair. Because the carbon tax affected people who have little choice in the short term, whereas people like us who fly over don't pay carbon tax on their plane tickets. So he somehow lost his battle on tax fairness. So that's his sort of comeback of the traditional reading of economic issues through a very distributional angle. Why did he lose this battle? I think he didn't make the case sufficiently strongly for what was necessary, that, you know, the taxes on capital income were too high. Capital income was paying, in some cases, more than 100% tax rate. So, you know, I mean, that's meant all of your capital income goes away, especially with very low capital return on bonds, etc. But they didn't make the case sufficiently strongly, didn't explain why it had to be done. You know, use a trickle-down theory, which we all know is not a very convincing theory to explain what was done, and lost the battle with public opinion. So in a way, that was a return of the traditional politics.
Tassos.
Yes.
Can I come in before he comes in?
We'll put a question to you. I'll come to you in a moment.
Yeah.
Is France becoming a better place to do business?
I think France was this was not a problem of France. Generally, France was not a bad place to do business, to my opinion, because they have the know-how, they have a relatively very well-organized state. They have also the manpower, they have what we call the managerial staff is not bad. France is not bad. The problem is that France, for me, is beginning to lose what was his atout. It's atout.
Assets.
The assets, yes. When I was in France, I discovered there what we call the meritocracy within a very selective system. That means equal chances to everybody to approach the best education. It was about the same with the health. I think that actually this is declining. This possibility is reduced to practically zero. That's why people in France are not satisfied.
Okay, thank you. Yorgo. France still has the biggest state, I think, other than Finland in the European Union. Is the size of the state something that Macron's failing to address?
I think he's trying to address it, and he should address it. But I think what we have more generally here is a disconnect between the politics and the economics. People voted for somebody who said that politically he's neither left nor right, or he's both left and right depending on the issues. When you translate that in economic terms, it's much harder for people to cross over traditional boundaries and identify a policy as being different from what they have traditionally categorized it as. Is reforming the pension system a right-wing policy? No, it is fundamentally an extremely progressive policy to make sure that it's viable for the future generations. But it's very hard to translate the easy political narrative when it comes down to nuts and bolts of the economics. And that's the trap that he fell into. What were his first two things that he did? First, he said, I'm going to stick to the fiscal targets because this gives me a better position to be able to talk to Germany. He could have asked for some fiscal space. He didn't, because he wanted to be able to sit on the table and not start from a position whereby he said, well, okay, I have to use a little bit more fiscal space. One, and then the second thing he did is he reduced some of the taxes on wealth, which I completely understand from the point of view of trying to bring back dynamism and investment into France. But immediately, this was partly justified, partly in an unjustified way, was labeled as, okay, the guy who's here for the rich people. And therefore, it went downhill from there. So politics is both what you do on substance and, of course, also what you do in terms of communication. So, and he's had here I completely agree with Jean, he's had a very difficult time explaining and balancing the two, even with some symbolic gestures that would show that his liberalizing strategy has got to be accompanied by a strategy of helping the more vulnerable.
Right, thank you. Back to anybody in the audience with a pressing question on the economy. So can we have a microphone over here, please? Microphone? Over there. Here.
My name is Papaconstantinou. In the face of what are essentially unknown unknowns in economic policy looking forward, globalization, longevity, etc., are we talking in the French case of a kind of delayed reformism, of implementing the same model that has worked elsewhere, or is France groping towards a model of its own?
Jean, would you try to answer that?
Yeah, in a way, I understand your question, because part of the reforms that are being implemented are reforms that were implemented before in other countries that corresponded to a certain mindset and a certain agenda. And today's agenda has changed. And, you know, for Macron, the sort of critical issue here is the transition to a low-carbon economy, which he has had difficulty to put at the forefront of his agenda, whereas now people are more obsessed and interested by, you know, how are we going to tackle that, than by how are we going to address our labor market problems. But our labor market problems are there. We've got to address them. So there is no way you can avoid it. What he's got to do is to connect the problems of today with the problem of tomorrow, like, for example, the future of work and all that.
Okay, thank you. We have to race on to our third subject, which is Macron in Europe. And here I'm going to ask Yorgo to introduce it. Is Macron's European agenda set out in these very grand speeches likely to succeed, or is it faltering?
Okay, let's go back to the night of his election. As a European citizen, I had the chills. Here's a guy who comes out for his victory speech, you know, and the Ode of Joy is playing the European anthem, and he has won an election on a clear, you know, without any reservations, European agenda. This was a turning point for Europe. Suddenly, we had the leader of a major European country that pushes forward the European agenda and that can sit on the table with Germany and get things done. This was back then. Has he delivered? The short answer is no. The longer answer is, again, we expected too much in too short a time. And the even longer answer is that, unfortunately, to be able to deliver on this agenda, the constellation has got to be right. And at that very point, the other side of the equation, Germany, wasn't able to move forward together with France. Now, what could have been such an agenda? Well, France would have come in, but let's say that, broadly speaking, there are the economic issues and the non-economic security, etc. issues. On the economic issues, the French could come in asking for a quick completion of the banking union, for some kind of a European budget or safe asset. They could have come in with a European insurance system for unemployment. And they did try to bring a lot of these things on the table. There were some fantastic speeches on Europe, which painted a very broad picture. But they didn't manage to get very much if we realistically look at where we are. If we look at every one of these topics, the only one where you can say that we have some advance is on a Euro budget, where we have a very limited agreement. It's positive, but it's not a breakthrough we're expecting. So if you can't, I think the brilliance of the approach in the beginning was to understand that you cannot solve or advance on the purely economic matters by themselves. You have to, because the conflicts are such, you broaden the agenda and get a bigger agreement. So what we then talked of as the grand bargain. So the idea there was, okay, we'll get Germany to give some stuff on the European agenda by France giving things on the security, defense agenda, sharing the seat in the Security Council, and generally being able, where it is stronger, give some leeway. Has this been successful? Only partly. So I think that for those that were expecting an extremely fast grand bargain that would push Europe decidedly forward as a result of Macron's election, it has been disappointing. For those who realize that, it's a slog, and, you go in small steps, and sometimes you have to go back and sideways, I wouldn't give up so easily. And I think that we have here an opportunity, if Macron, having gone over the worst part of his presidency, if he manages to go to European elections and do reasonably well, he can regain an advantage here. The question is, what happens on the other side, and the other side being Germany. And again, the hope here was that the legacy term Merkel would be able to do more. We're not seeing it. And that is a real concern. To me, the concern is more on the German side than on the French side.
Right, thank you very much, Jorgo, for introducing that. Christine, Jorgo just raised the question of the European elections. 2 years ago, we might have expected a big Macron bloc in the European Parliament. Is he going to have a significant influence on the next European Parliament, do you think?
Well, as you know, the political mapping of the European Parliament is particularly complex, and it seems that with the populist surge in some European countries, it will even be more scattered than it has been so far. So you will see that the traditional conservatives, the EPP, which, by the way, Mr. Orban still belongs to, and the current German Bavarian, should I say, candidate for the head of the European Commission actually campaigned for Mr. Orban in Hungary not so long ago. The EPP will probably lose ground, so will the Social Democrats. And there will be probably a constellation of smaller parties, populist parties, to use an easy word. But that doesn't mean they would agree on specifics necessarily. As we know, I mean, Hungary doesn't agree with Poland or with Slovakia on quite a few issues. So it will probably be a parliament which will slow down the decision process because it's scattered. What is more worrying...
Christine, would you expect a Macron influence to emerge in
Well, Macron has, I mean, he has no political party in the current European Parliament. Of course, his ambition was to try and create a sort of dynamism which would attract to his core party, and it may still happen. With the liberals, Verhofstadt and all these people, they could be some sort of a nucleus. But as you recall, he wanted to create some transnational seats, taking advantage of the handful of British seats. But who knows? Maybe the Brits will still be there. Anyway, that hasn't worked out. But just one other point, which I think is not stressed enough so far, these European elections, they will change the physiognomy of the parliament. But I think the real danger is to have populist members in the ministers at the council level. And that would be a slowdown, that you would have representatives of countries who deliberately would be Eurosceptics, because that's not happened before to that extent.
Jean, among other things, you were one of the 14 French and German economists who made a suggestion about where things should go on European economic governance, and yet France seems to be subject to less intense pressures than Italy for the same kind of breaking of the rules. Do you think that France is going to influence the future development of European economic governance to the degree that you would have hoped?
This is a very specific and quite technical issue that you're putting forward. I mean, George spoke a bit on the budget. I think, you know, for the governance of the euro area, I'm not satisfied with where we are. I think the risks are still there. Italy illustrates very well the persistence of the doom loop between banks and sovereigns. We don't have a complete banking union. We don't have an instrument for stabilization. We don't know how we're going to fight the next recession. Who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be the ECB again? Or is the ECB going to be supported in some way to fight the next recession? So the big questions about the euro area governance. Now, I wanted also to sort of more react to the, because we discussed the policy side. There's also the political side that Christine touched upon, which I think is very important also, which is, does this separation, the split between the progressives and the nationalists that Macron sort of put forward as a new divide, does it make sense, and is it going to structure the political conversation in Europe? In my view, it is actually the core of the political conversation we're having in Europe, because you know Europe has not been so much about left and right. There have always been compromises between left and right, but the question now is: do we believe? And that goes back to the previous panel we've had with some of the people here. Do we believe there need to be European solutions, or do we believe that nations should take back control and limit the encroachment to sovereignty? And that's the big issue, the defining issue for the years to come. Now, the big question is it going to be also perceived as a political discussion that resonates with the electorates? And is it going to sort of, you know, transform into alliances that make sense, that are visible, and that put forward agenda? And that's not a done deal by far. Also because internally, in many of our countries, the traditional left-right divide is still alive and well. France is perhaps special in this regard. Italy is perhaps special in this regard. But Germany, Spain, many other countries are still, you know, very much structured by the traditional divide.
Tassos, so a very quick question to you. As a Greek with a French background, looking at what Macron's trying to achieve in Europe, do you welcome it, or do you think he's going in the wrong direction?
I welcome it for the main reason that I think that what a common friend to me and George said, that the German mentality, la mentalité punitive dictée par l'éthique protestante, the German mentality,
the punitive mentality dictated by German Protestants,
which tries, yes, who tries to hegemonize Europe under such idea, if not combined with the same friend of us, la solidarité prônée par l'esprit des Lumières, means the completely different way of facing the French philosophy of facing solidarity. I think Europe will not succeed. Greece, which is the smallest country, will be the one of the first victims, but generally Europe, in front of the upcoming, we call it now non-Occidental era, that means the European economy will leave the first class of economies and will become a second-class economy with China, with India. If so, this combination does not succeed, the whole thing will collapse, and we will step back to 100 years behind.
Okay, thank you. I regret we only have 1 minute left, and I want to give the four panelists the chance to answer one last question. Are you optimistic that in, let's say, 3 years' time, we will look back on Macron's presidency and say he achieved much of his agenda? Christine, you have 14 seconds to answer.
You know, there's that marvelous formula which is attributed to Gramsci. the pessimism of experience and the optimism of the mind. I think that will do. I'm optimistic.
Yorgo.
I'm also optimistic, but of course everything depends on whether he gets a second term. And if he does, then, because the kind of structural reforms that we've talked both at the national and the European level, as we've found in this country to our detriment, require a long time.
Jean?
I will be optimistic also, but I'm afraid it tells you something about the composition of this panel.
And a last word to Tassos.
I am optimistic because I cannot be pessimistic, coming from a small country which is watching what happens.
Right, well, in that case, we conclude on an optimistic note all round. So let me thank the panel and thank the audience for coming along.